Hi there, my name's Mike. The channel's called GL. I talk about media and media studies topics, including theory and analysis. Feel free to stick around. I want to talk about the hodgepodge quality of Lazy in Space, but we have to take a bit of a walk to get there. So a lot of people have definitely picked up on Bee and Puppycat's focus on young adulthood, or more broadly, the process of making big decisions that will affect what a person's life will become, which can happen at many different ages, actually. Bee is a poster child for indecision. Psych students are probably already familiar with Erikson's stages of development, each of which is presented as an either-or, such as trust versus mistrust, or intimacy versus isolation, the latter of which we could also apply to this show. But specifically, Erikson describes the middle age paradigm as generativity versus stagnation. In other words, you either find something to do and you do it, or you basically don't do anything. I'm not here to tell you that Erikson's stages of development are objectively correct, but I do know that this is a dynamic that a lot of people are familiar with already, and it's definitely something I continue to feel in my own life. There are both external and internal pressures to find your calling and spend most of your waking hours working in your chosen field. If you don't want to spend your life working, or if you can't seem to find a field that you actually care about, you're either going to be poor, generally unhappy, or both. Do you remember when adulting was a big term? Some of the younger Gen Z kids might not remember, but this was a big thing that came up in blanket discussions about young millennials roughly 10 years ago, since a lot of us belonging to that age group seemed to be struggling to find reliable, well-paying work that would enable home ownership and the other material trappings of an image of adulthood that had defined adult life for older generations. The discourse was just nonsense in the first place, and I would love to talk about the system-wide prejudices at work sort of behind the scenes, but I won't right now. Instead, I want to highlight that this whole discussion of this stunted transition to adulthood drew a lot of attention to a relatively novel image of a young adult who just didn't fit in to the standard structure of Western capitalist society. It's the image of a person who does have skills of some kind, though they probably aren't skills that are especially valuable in the current market. It's someone who is passionate about plenty of stuff, but not really passionate about work. Someone who is already weighed down by large amounts of debt, and who doesn't seem to have clear goals for the future. Bee is one of the best manifestations of that image we've gotten so far. Watching this new Netflix show is to be drawn into her world, which is a world of stagnation and languish. If you relate to her character and her situation, the show probably feels kind of comfortable and familiar in a certain way. And if you don't relate, it probably feels relatively uncomfortable. I think this is one of the most important factors to anyone's enjoyment of Lazy in Space. Bee and Puppycat feel so different compared to a lot of other contemporary animation. That's a good thing, and I find that aspect really exciting, but it also means that it's hard to compare and recommend it against other work. This isn't the kind of show where I can say, well, if you already like XYZ, then you'll like this. I do think that tonally, it sometimes approaches the more ponderous episodes of Adventure Time or even BoJack Horseman at points, but it's absolutely not something for everyone. And probably one of the biggest barriers to casual enjoyment of Lazy in Space is its pacing and structure, or more specifically, its lack of traditional story structure. So I have a whole video about the relationship between media structure and content, and to sum up, I'm a big proponent of using new structures to tell stories, rather than relying on the same basic structure that humans have been stuck on for literally thousands of years. But regardless of my preferences, there are positives and negatives to both traditional and non-traditional structure. One of the biggest benefits of traditional structure is that it can make a viewer feel safe and supported. It's really what they're used to in terms of storytelling. They know what to expect. Traditional structure can also contribute to brisk, even story pacing. But if you take the viewer out of their comfort zone, they might get uncomfortable. That makes sense, right? They might wonder why nothing seems to be happening in the story. They might get bored and distracted. And there's definitely a stretch of episodes in Lazy in Space that, in terms of structure, it just feels like soup. A really chunky soup with a whole bunch of nonsense thrown in. The runtime for each episode doesn't feel like a good fit for the actual content of that episode. Sometimes there's one big storyline to follow, other times you basically get two separate storylines, one after the other. Some episodes don't feel like they have a strong storyline at all. Things just happen. And in any episode, from moment to moment, the show just interrupts itself with a lot of different stuff, whether it's a character literally crashing through the wall, or a TV show that a character is watching, or maybe a flashback or a fantasy. It's all over the map, and that's not out of place at all for internet media. Even just on YouTube, there's a ton of that kind of stuff. But it is kind of out of place for a big produced show on a streaming service. This sort of messy approach to structure isn't necessarily bad. I think it's actually kind of admirable. But on a practical level, it makes it hard to keep your attention on the show, or at least that's how it was for me. And I don't usually have trouble paying attention to something that I'm watching. But I'm curious, was all this randomness part of the team's vision for the show, or is it just the result of an attempt to stretch things out and hit these standard TV/streaming runtimes? And apart from my understanding of why so many episodes feel this way, I also have to consider how this soupy structure is going to affect the viewing experience of anyone new to the series. With the launch of the Netflix show, a lot of people are discovering Bee and Puppycat for the first time, and I wouldn't blame a newcomer for not knowing exactly what the show is. Even the basic question of whether the show is for children, adults, or both is difficult to answer here. Visually, it's candy. Like, the environment and the character designs are really easy on the eyes, so in that sense, it could be for anyone. But then there's the subject matter and messaging of the show, which we've already talked about. It seems to be aimed at young adults and teenagers. But despite that subject matter, a lot of episodes feel totally suitable for kids. But then, for seemingly unknown reasons, there's an episode or two, I think it's just 2 episodes, maybe 1, where these side characters start cussing kind of violently. And the cussing itself is censored, which is its own decision. Kind of a weird choice. But I'm actually one of those people who feel that sometimes censored swears can come across as even more severe than the bad words that they're actually covering up. I mean, can you imagine a parent walking in on their little youngster watching this, like, seemingly, crazy day-glow cartoon show, and then they're hearing bleeps all of a sudden? And this element is made even weirder by how temporary it is. After those episodes, the show just trucks along without any more, inappropriate content, maybe some references to adult topics, but nothing explicit. So the big question I have coming away from part 1 of Lazy in Space is whether the show is trying to be a hodgepodge, or if it simply became a hodgepodge over the course of a very long production cycle. Now, is this question important to the average person's enjoyment of the show? Probably not. You'll know pretty quickly whether you like Lazy in Space, whether it clicks with you. And even if the hodgepodginess here wasn't intentional, it can't really make that a point of criticism either, because it's on theme. It's not just Bee who's struggling to find a sense of direction in her life. Most of the main cast is in a similar situation. If we want to get more interpretive even, we could say that maybe the entire island is trapped in some kind of motivation drought. Actually, that's not a bad story premise. Ultimately, part 1 of Lazy in Space feels like a big giant setup for whatever is going to happen in part 2. And I have a hunch that the meandering tone and pacing will start to fall away as plot becomes a more pronounced component. But if that's how things turn out, then I'll certainly still be revisiting part 1 when I want some hangout media. The first watch may have been kind of difficult for me, but now that I know what the show is about, what it feels like, I think I'll have a much easier time accepting these episodes for what they are, an almost random collection of images and events, some of which carry significance and some of which don't really matter at all. And I'd say that's a pretty accurate reflection of adult life. Thank you so much for joining me for the entire video. Please share your thoughts and feelings if you have any. That's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.